All right. So here we are again for another week. So glad to see you. We've got 5 people in class. That's all I need. Hello to all of those who are uh, attending synchronously and to those who will be watching the recording. So guys, I'm very excited. This is a new week. We've got a lot more material to get through. I think, God willing, we're going to get through all of the arguments for the existence of God this week, as well as Leibniz's argument for optimism, that this is the best of all possible worlds. We're gonna see how in the world a philosopher could try to defend something like that. So our goal for today is to finish what we started last class. We're gonna finish up the logic outline, hopefully, quickly go through what a philosophy paper looks like and some best practices for writing a philosophy paper that makes it different from regular papers. Then we're going to dive right into the readings, which is going to be, first of all, St. Thomas Aquinas's 5 proofs for the existence of God. 3 of them are what are technically known as cosmological arguments, but we're going to talk about all 5. They're all rather straightforward and short, but I just want to get through them. Then we're also going to look at someone called William Paley, and he has an argument that you might consider teleological, which is basically a design argument, right? And so if we have enough time, we'll even be able to squeeze in a really short look at Leibniz, who has some really interesting arguments related to God's goodness and how we can maintain the idea not only that God exists, but that he's good in spite of certain features we find in the world, such as evil. All right, so let's pick up where we left off last time. So we were looking at logic, and we introduced it. We practiced a few examples. Now we can get right to it. There are 2 basic types of arguments: deductive arguments and inductive arguments. Good deductive arguments are arguments where the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. Therefore, good deductive arguments are always valid. Validity, guys, is a status that an argument has in virtue of the fact that the statements supporting the conclusion support it so well that if the statements supporting the conclusion, known as premises, are all true, then the conclusion necessarily has no other option than also to be true. And that's a kind of goodness, that's a kind of virtue that an argument can have. And that virtue we call validity. So a valid argument is one where the logical structure of the argument is such that if the premises are true, then the conclusion also has to be true. Now, good inductive arguments are a bit different. See, a good inductive argument is an argument where the premises do support the conclusion, but not in that rigid, fixed, automatic way, not in that necessary way. There's a kind of support, but it fails to reach the level of necessity, all right? So good inductive arguments are arguments where the premises do support the conclusion, but the conclusion does not necessarily follow from the premises. Therefore, even good inductive arguments are invalid. They don't have the status of validity. So a valid argument, guys, is an argument where the conclusion logically follows necessarily from the premises. All right, that's a valid argument. But there's something even better than a valid argument. An argument that is sound is an argument which is valid and where the premises or the supporting statements are true. Now that's a really good argument, where not only the logical structure is good, but you have reason to believe that each of the premises is true. Because remember, If each of the premises are true and the logical structure is valid, then what do we know about the conclusion automatically? That it's true, right? So that's like a perfect argument, but we use a more modest term. Instead of a perfect argument, we just call it a sound argument, all right? All right, so let's look at the deductive argument, also known as the deductive inference or deductive reasoning. Here's an example. All men are mortal. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. If all men are mortal is the first premise, and your second premise says Socrates is a man, what does that necessarily imply? You start with all men are mortal. And then Socrates is a man. Therefore, what necessarily follows from those two supporting statements? All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, go ahead. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. See, all men, if you are a man, then you have the property of mortality. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates has the property of mortality. Guys, that is a classic example of deductive reasoning. So you take an entire category of things and you define that category on the basis of it having a certain property. And then you offer an example of one member of that category, right? So you've got the category and you define the category in terms of the property. And then you nominate one member as an example of that category. Well, if that category necessarily has its property, and this member is truly a member of that category, then that member necessarily has the properties that all the members of that category has. All right? So, just because this is a valid argument, however, does not necessarily mean that it's a sound one. So it's true that if all men are mortal is true and Socrates is a man is true, therefore Socrates is mortal follows necessarily. But that would make it valid. Is this a sound argument? Well, that's tricky. Are all men mortal? And how would you know? Is that the kind of thing we can ever know? Something to think about. Because if we're going to give it the status true, that's a big, big leap. We have to support that. Same with Socrates is a man. What if Socrates is kind of like Jesus? What if he's more than a man? All right? So anyway, a deductive argument is valid if the conclusion is necessarily true when all the premises are true. Now let's look at inductive argument, inference, and reasoning. There are three types of inductive argument. There's enumerative induction, analogical induction, and hypothetical induction. And this last one, hypothetical induction, is also known as abduction or inference to the best explanation. So guys, let's look at the way we're using words. To deduce something is to start with a kind of category that's rigid and fixed. You know absolutely certainly what all the members of this category necessarily have as properties. And because you have that rigid fixed definition, you deduce from that category what the properties of each member of the category has. That's a deduction. So the use of words is very important here. You only deduce things which you have already firmly determined as a matter of definition, right? So being a man is by definition being mortal. There is no room for debate. Or maybe there is, I don't know. Let's take something even easier. All bachelors are unmarried. Or all bachelors are male. Or all bachelors are unmarried males. That's the kind of thing that you cannot debate about because it's built into the definition. If you disagreed with all bachelors are unmarried males, then that means you don't understand the word bachelor. just as a matter of convention. That's how we define bachelor. But if that's true, if we say all bachelors are unmarried males, and then we say Socrates is a bachelor, then it follows without any doubt. You don't have to look at the world, nothing. Pure implication. It follows that as a matter of deductive reasoning, Socrates must be an unmarried male if he's a bachelor, okay? Now, inductive reasoning is very different. To deduce something is to start with something defined whose properties you know necessarily, whereas induction is a tricky business. Induction is something more like this. Well, every zebra I've ever seen has had stripes. Now, does that mean that no zebra could ever not have stripes? Right? It's a bit tricky. All bachelors are unmarried males. The concept bachelor necessarily implies being single, being unmarried, and being male. But does the concept zebra necessarily imply stripes? Well, think about it this way. A bachelor is simply defined as an unmarried male, so you don't have to look at the world to figure out what a bachelor is, his status as unmarried or male. But a zebra is the type of thing that you have to observe, right? It's not like a bachelor. A bachelor is a pure concept. A zebra is a kind of specimen. And if you look at many specimens, okay, you've seen 10 zebras in your life, all of them had stripes. Now let's go back to the supporting statements. Can you go from all 10 zebras I have ever seen in my life have had stripes to therefore all zebras in existence have stripes? Do you see the weakness? That's induction. Do you see that? That's to induce. You are leaping. You are taking a certain limited range of experience and you're jumping from that limited range of experience and doing what? We call it generalizing, right? You're making a generalization. You're going from some specimen or some group of specimen to an entire generalization. Yeah, there is a kind of support that the premises have for the conclusion, but it's not got that rock solid implication, that necessity that we had with deduction, all right? So let's go through some examples so we can really get a feel for what induction is compared to deduction. Let's first start off with enumerative induction. This is generalization about a group of things after observing only some members of that group. Example, all the zebras I have ever observed have stripes. Therefore, all zebras in existence or in the world or blah, 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 or in the universe have stripes. Do you see the leap? Guys, this is also what we call what? Stereotypes, right? Stereotypes fall in this category. Every African-American male I've seen on TV, on the news, has been a drug dealer. I wouldn't be surprised if some people have had either that exact experience or something similar. I mean, maybe their local news just covers things like that. Who knows? Who knows? But you get my point, right? Some people, maybe by accident, by chance, or whatever, might have certain very specific patterns of experiences, certain series or sequences. Every time they hear about a black male on the news, it involves either violence or drug dealing. It's possible. Now, it's a separate issue whether or not that makes them a racist, right? If you walk around thinking all black males are violent because every single black male I've seen on TV, on the news, has been violent, if you make that leap, that's the only experience you have of black males, and you go from all the black males I've ever seen on TV are violent to all black males are violent, does that make you a racist? I don't know. It'd be interesting to hear what you think about that. Because, I mean, let's face it, guys, if you come from some small town that's mainly white in the Midwest, and all you've ever been exposed to, the only specimens of black males, young black males in particular, is, you know, people, juvenile delinquency or problems with the law. Is it your fault that you haven't been exposed to any other variety of male, young black male than that? It's interesting. You're making generalizations, right? But are your generalizations malicious? Are they inadequate? Probably, I would agree, definitely they're inadequate. But are they malicious? Is there, you know, racism implies something malicious, right? Interesting. That's why I said here at UM, we should be kind of patient with one another and realize that just because we're all UM students, doesn't mean we've all had the same experiences, you know? We got to recognize that people have been having different experiences, and that leads them to make different judgments. So, you know, a part of philosophy is opening your mind, and doing this inductive argument work helps us realize where some of our patterns of thinking come from. Induction is one of them. Let's look at analogical induction. This is the inference that two things that are similar in some respects are similar in some further respects. All right? So you got two things, right? But you can't see everything about one of them. So you got two things that are similar. Everything that you can see about them is similar, but in one of them, there's something hidden. And so you say, I see, okay. These two objects, they're similar in so many other respects that I have good reason to believe that even in the hidden part, they must continue to be similar. Do you see that? That's a kind of analogical induction. You're going beyond your experience. You have a limited experience, but you feel justified in going beyond that experience. So it's not deduction. Again, it's another kind of induction. So the example I have is, I show certain bodily behaviors when I'm in certain mental states, right? Like when I'm thirsty, I say things like, man, I would love some water. Or when I'm thirsty, I also just reach for a glass of cold water, all right? So when I show certain bodily behaviors when I'm in certain mental states, other people also show these bodily behaviors on certain occasions. Now here's what's going on, guys. Remember, one of the big mysteries about being human is whether or not we are just bodies, or whether we are bodies and minds, or whether we are just minds. And let's just assume we're a duality. Let's assume that we're both bodies and minds. Well, an interesting thing happens. As you look around, what do you see in your classmates? Do you see their minds or their bodies? Bodies, right? Now you see their bodies. So their bodies are kind of public. Everybody can see them, and they're kind of objective almost. But what about their minds? Can you see those? Their mind seems to be a bit private and subjective. Only the person themselves can know what's on their own minds, unless you're some sort of psychic or mind reader. But otherwise, as I look at you now, I can see your public bodies, but your private minds are relative to you. They're subjective. Your bodies are objective. We can all surround these bodies and inspect them and agree on the properties. But when it comes to your mind, you might be thinking things that I have no idea of. Now, what are the implications of this? So I show certain bodily behaviors when I'm in certain mental states, right? When I'm thirsty, I say, I would love a glass of cold water, or I reach for some cold water. Those are typical behaviors of someone who's in the mental state of thirst or hunger. Now, you look around and you say, okay, I know that these people in this room have bodies, and I've got a body. And I know that my body behaves a certain way when I have mental states, and the only mind I'm aware of is my own. And when I have certain mental states like hunger or thirst, I tend to have certain behaviors. Now, I can't see the minds of other people, What can I see though? What can I see in others that's similar to what I can see in myself? You can't see their mental states, but you can see what? Bodily behaviors. So you can see their body, and along with the body, you can see the bodily behaviors. And some of those bodily behaviors are similar to what you show in your bodily behaviors when you have certain mental states. So even though you can't directly see that they have minds, you can figure out that they must have minds. Why? Because you're similar in all these other respects, right? You got all these similarities on the body side. You know you've got a mind. So you just say, hey, wait a minute. What reason do I have to doubt that these bodies are not accompanied by some mind? If she reaches for a bottle of water and drinks it, why shouldn't I assume that there's a mental state, a feeling of thirst? Do you see that? That's induction. That's a kind of reasoning. You're figuring things out. It's not completely supported. It's not necessarily true the same way all bachelors are unmarried men, but there's a kind of support. There's a leap there, and it's a leap that seems reasonable or justified. All right, finally, hypothetical induction. This is the inference that it is probable that some hypothesis is true if it would provide the best explanation for some phenomenon. So here's an example. You wake up one morning and there's a pool of water outside your door. Now you think really carefully, how could it happen that there's a pool of water right outside my door? You know, could someone be playing a prank on me and they just poured the water there? Am I a sleepwalker? And I just went outside in the middle of the night and poured the water, went back to bed and forgot all about it. Or you remember that it was slightly overcast last night and you look at the pool of water and you notice that the pool of water isn't just in front of your door, but it's kind of spread out. Now, you don't have evidence. You didn't see it happen, right? But kind of like a detective looking at clues, you can say, all right, there's a pool of water outside my door. I'm going to make a guess or a hypothesis. You guys have heard this word hypothesis, right? I'm going to make a hypothesis. The hypothesis is that it rained last night. And why am I making just this hypothesis? Because it's the best explanation for why there's a pool of water outside my door. There are other explanations, like the sleepwalking and the prank, but you have to stretch the facts, and now the probability of these events doesn't seem very high, whereas the overcast sky last night, it increases the probability that there really was some rain. So the hypothesis that it rained last night best explains why there's a pool of water outside my door. So if that's the hypothesis that best explains why there's a pool of water outside your door, then you can go ahead and make the leap. It's justifiable to make the leap that it's probable that it rained last night. You can figure out that it rained last night that way. Do you have evidence that it rained? Were you there to see it? No. But the hypothesis that is the best candidate for explaining this is that it rained last night. And that's why I said earlier, this is known as abduction or inference to the best explanation. You infer that the best explanation for any given phenomenon is what must be true. All right? Now, guys, we're going to finish up. We're just going to look at some common fallacies. A fallacy, what do you think a fallacy is? We're going to look at some fallacies that people typically make when they do logic. What do you think? When you hear the word fallacy, what comes to mind? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, it's a way of thinking that's kind of habitual or even tempting. And you might not catch yourself when you're doing it, but by being mindful of typical fallacies, you can weed out this kind of bad reasoning. This is very bad reasoning. And if you weed it out enough, you might be left only with the good habits of logic and reasoning. So we're just going to look at 5 common fallacies. The aim isn't to expose you to all of them. There's plenty of fallacies. But I'm just going to give you a good idea of what a fallacy is like so you can know to beware of these kind of things. So the first fallacy is known as appeal to masses. It must be true or good because everybody believes it or does it, right? Now, this is clearly, what's wrong with this kind of reasoning? It must be true because everybody believes it. Go ahead. There's no evidence for that at all. Everybody believing something is not a kind of evidence. I'm sorry. Everybody has opinions and all this stuff. And, you know, a lot of times people consume, you know, mainstream media, social media, Instagram, you know, they're consuming all this stuff. Then there's straight up gossip. I mean, just because everyone thinks that, I don't know, what's something everyone thinks? Just because everyone thinks that Selena Gomez should have stayed with Justin Bieber, does that make it true that he was the best for her or she was the best for him? Everybody, public opinion is going crazy. Like, oh my God, these two people belong together. How could they break up? Okay, even let's assume. First of all, how would you figure out that everybody believes it? Oh my God. Do you remember we were talking about burdens last class? That's a huge burden. But let's just go ahead and assume. Let's say everybody believes that Selena Gomez should have stayed with Justin Bieber. Why on earth would the fact that everybody believes that make it true or even suggest that it's true? And this gets problematic, guys, because in our legal system, our trials are based on juries, right? Now, what do juries have to do in a criminal trial? They have to give a verdict in which they reach an agreement beyond reasonable doubt that they believe this person was guilty. But look at what we just said. Just because everybody believes something, what does that say about the status of the truth of their opinion? You are in trial with a jury of your peers. I guess it feels good to say, you know what? It's not a judge who dictated to me my sentence or even determined my guilt. Some average people just like me were selected by the prosecutors and the defense attorney, average everyday people. So when they looked at the evidence and they looked at me, probably they were unbiased. Okay, I see why we have a jury system, and I'm not knocking it. But I'm saying from a purely philosophical point of view, unanimity, being unanimous, having consensus is not a kind of evidence, I'm sorry. And the same problem that we see in the legal system is true of what? Science. What is science but democracy? Every scientist in the world agrees with every other scientist that everything is made of atoms. I mean, it may be true that everything is made of atoms, but what makes it true is not the agreement between the scientists. It's tricky. Expertise, right? Expertise is something very, very tricky because we're talking about appeal to the masses, right? Now, when we talk about the masses, we're talking about common, everyday, regular folk who don't have an expertise. Their opinions, no matter how much in agreement, do not constitute a kind of evidence or truth. What about a group of experts? Do you think that a group of experts who all agree on something, does that increase the weight of their opinion to a kind of truth? The jury on a court is not a group of experts. They're guided by experts, some psychiatric evidence, some forensic evidence, you know what I mean? There's that kind of influence. But at the end of the day, they're just supposed to use their, a jury by a trial where you have a jury of one's peers. You want someone regular, just like you, who's going to look at you and see your humanity and kind of be sympathetic, but still process the evidence. Now, what about an expert like a scientist or a doctor or a lawyer? If that group of people unanimously agree on something, does it make it more true because they have expertise? Does convention itself in some group of professionals, does that itself support or provide a kind of evidence? I don't think we can go that deep in this class, but I'm just giving you something to think about, guys. Number 2, appeal to tradition. Something must be true or good because it is a part of an established tradition. We've always done it this way, so it must be true or good. What's wrong with that? From time immemorial, we have sacrificed children, our firstborn children, to the god Hagawa. And so it must be good because, for one, Hagawa has kept us safe and prosperous, and we've defeated all our enemies in war. I mean, we've survived, right? So clearly it must be good. What's wrong with that kind of reasoning? Go ahead.
Change in progress can be made.
Sorry, what?
Change in progress can be made.
Yeah, change in progress can be made. Very good. Yeah, absolutely, guys. If you're saying that something is good or true just because it's always been done, you are not entertaining the possibility that things could be otherwise, which is what you're saying. Progress or change. Guys, truth is independent of habit, and that includes logical habits, customary habits, cultural habits. All of those have nothing to do with truth. I mean, whether or not something is true or good has to be determined independent of the usage of the practice itself. All right? You cannot say that because we have had the Inquisition for 300 years, that precedent by itself makes the Inquisition good. I mean, the mere fact that you've had it. Now, I want you to know something about our legal system. In America, we have a legal system that is based on precedent. So we have a judge-made law. Judges make decisions, and later judges always defer to the decisions of earlier judges. So there is a kind of deference to tradition in our legal system, and it's very prestige-oriented. So overturning some case law that has already happened is always a big deal. That's why when you hear Supreme Court cases like Obergefell, do you know Obergefell? The Supreme Court case Obergefell, do you know what I'm talking about? What is that?
I can remember from civics class.
Yeah, in 2015, the US Supreme Court overturned the marriage bans for gay marriage. So up till 2015, it had been up to the states to use their constitutional amendments or their Supreme Courts to individually ban or not ban gay marriage. But in 2015, in June, the Supreme Court of the United States, the federal Supreme Court, said it is unconstitutional to deny gay people the right to get married just like straight people. So that was a big deal because they overturned previous case law, and they were also reinterpreting the Constitution. So I'm just giving you a feel for how all this logic actually plays out in some of our institutions. All right, number 3, argument against the person, also known as the ad hominem fallacy. It must be false because of the character of the person who presents it. He's homeless, so obviously, right? whatever he says must be false because he's homeless. He's a foreigner. How could we trust what a foreigner says? You see how these are bad logical habits? This is just mere prejudice, guys. It has nothing to do with truth. Of course, it's not saying that everything he says is true, but you certainly can't conclude, in a valid way that just because someone is a foreigner or an immigrant, that whatever they say must be false. I mean, where are you getting that from? Number 4, very interesting, the naturalistic fallacy. It must be okay or permissible because it happens in nature. You ever heard about the alpha male who dominates the other males, gets all the ladies, takes all the food? Now, there are certain societies, well, a lot of societies in history have been patriarchal, but there are certain societies that are more patriarchal than others. In a lot of history, we have aristocracies. And as I was telling you in earlier classes, in these aristocracies, many of them were dominated either by the church or the military or both. And you can find alpha males in both of those. Now, some people might say, aristocracy, it's the natural way of things. Some men deserve higher rank than others. Patriarchy is natural because look at nature. Men dominate women in our society because in nature, the male dominates the female and the male even dominates other males. You see that kind of argument? That's a kind of argument, right? You're saying it happens in nature, so it's justified here. In nature, we see nothing but survival of the fittest. So, in our society, hey, we got scarcity, we got limited resources, so let it be also like in nature. Social Darwinism, survival of the fittest. Do you see how that's fallacious? Why do you say that just because it happens in nature, then that means it's either permissible or even obligatory in our society? You see that? How do you make that leap? How do you support that? I don't think it's supportable. This is a deep, deep topic, guys, because patriarchy is at the center of social justice, right? The one big target that they have is patriarchy. Patriarchy is a problem for feminists. Patriarchy is a problem for many people who are looking for racial reform or racial justice. Patriarchy is a problem for the LGBT community. You know what I mean? And many people are going to defend. They're going to step back and say, whoa, gender is something metaphysical. Gender is something, you can see these patterns in nature, right? You don't see Steve and Tom doing it in nature. They're going to say that. So, there's 2 responses. One, yes, you do see Steve and Tom. Steve Penguin and Tom Penguin, they do pair bond. Not only do they get it on with each other, they actually form pair bonds. They become couples and lifelong couples. So gay relationships actually exist in nature. But even putting that aside, even if they didn't exist in nature, once again, what does that suggest? Does that suggest that we can't do it? Do we take our standards for living from animals? Do animals give us our standards for how we're going to live? Think about that. Oh, let me see what the baboons are doing, and then I'll figure out what I'll do. You got to think about these things, guys. Finally, begging the question. An argument begs the question or argues in a circle when its conclusion is used as one of its premises. This is kind of like someone who says, oh yeah, I know that Jane, she has mental telepathy. And then someone asks you, well, how do you know she has mental telepathy? And then you say, because she read my mind. Can you see the problem with that? Why is that? I want someone to spell it out. Why is that problematic? You've used different words. Your first response and your second response, they are different words, but there's a huge problem. What is the problem? She reads my mind. How do you know she reads my mind? Just because you said she has mental telepathy doesn't mean you're saying anything independent or different. You're saying she reads my mind. How do you know she reads my mind? You see that? All right, guys, enough about logic. I think you guys might actually enjoy logic. It is really enjoyable. And I know I've kind of downplayed it in this class, but that's because there's so much content to get through, man. It's like, there's a lot of content to get through. So that was enough about logic. I think you have an idea what logic is like. There are whole classes just about logic. There's what we call propositional logic. There's predicate logic. There's modal logic. There's all sorts of different logics out there, but they're just beyond the scope of this class. So we shall not proceed further. Now, let's go to the other reference material. How to write a philosophy paper. All right, guys, how to write a philosophy paper. Let me share this. Okay. How to write a philosophy paper. So you guys have an assignment. Now, just to clarify some things, most philosophy and history has probably been discussion, like two people talking, or maybe one person lecturing. Every now and then, that person talking or the student will record down what they wrote. So people like Aristotle have lecture notes. Plato was a great artist, so he made dialogues. And so I think most philosophy has been conversational and spoken, and a lot of that has not been captured from the ancient and medieval worlds. But a lot of philosophy, or a lot of really good philosophy, has been written down. Now, of the philosophy that has been written down, as I said before, some has been dialogues, some has been lecture notes like Aristotle's. But over time, one particular form or one particular format came to dominate, and that's the essay. But in philosophy, we don't call it typically an essay, we call it a paper. So in philosophy, we talk about writing a philosophy paper. It's a specific type of essay, all right? A specific type of essay. All right, let's go through. Here's the best practices and the main things you need to know about how to write a philosophy paper, all right? A philosophy paper is an argumentative essay that tries to support a given conclusion persuasively by using reasons, examples, distinctions, and principles. These aren't the only things you might use, but these are the main ones. This is the real stock that it's made of. So a philosophy paper is argumentative, meaning what? It doesn't necessarily mean that it uses logic the way we were looking at with deduction and induction, but it does mean that it's persuasive. It has a particular conclusion in mind, and it's trying to urge the reader or direct him in the direction of supporting or agreeing with that conclusion. And the way it does it is by these things called reasons, examples, distinctions, and principles, all right? So let's get into it. What are reasons? Well, reasons are kind of stories, narratives, or accounts that we tell to explain why something happens, or what something is, or how something works. So for instance, if you are late to work and your boss asks you why you're late, your reason may be that your car broke down or that you had a family emergency unexpectedly that you had to deal with. So guys, we talk about reason. Use your reason. Use your reason. But what is your reason? Your reason just is, I want to suggest to you, storytelling. Right? But not all stories are relevant. If you're going to give a good reason for something, you've got to tell a relevant story. If your boss asks you why you're late, and you say, the mayor jumped up and down in his pajamas. I mean, you just told a story, but that's not a good reason. I don't think it's even a reason. It's so irrelevant that it's not even a reason. But when we're trying to explain why something is the way it is, or what something is, or how something works, the way we do that is by giving an account, or a narrative, or a story. In other words, a reason, right? So, you might explain why gases, when subjected to high pressure, tend to contract in volume, right? In physics and chemistry, you have these gas laws. And so pressure and volume have a certain relationship. And the more pressure you apply to a fixed mass of gas at a fixed temperature, the more pressure you apply, the smaller the volume. So if the more pressure you apply, the smaller the volume, then that means mathematically they have an inverse relationship to each other. You see that? And if they have an inverse relationship to each other, you might ask a question, well, why do they have this inverse relationship to each other? And so from a scientific point of view, your hypothesis that would explain this inverse relationship would be something like, actually, gases are fluids, and in the fluid state, everything is made of matter or particles or molecules, and those molecules have intermolecular forces. And so when you apply pressure to a gas at a fixed temperature and mass, what happens is these gas molecules come closer together, and then the volume decreases. So as you apply more pressure and more force, the volume decreases. Now, it gets harder and harder to apply more and more pressure as the volume shrinks. Now, that's another mystery. Why would that happen? Well, if there are truly intermolecular forces, and these intermolecular forces are repulsive, now you have a reason, right? Because the closer the molecules get to each other, the more they repel each other. So it gets harder and harder to squeeze smaller volumes and make them even smaller. That's an example of a reason why gases have those laws that they do. All right, guys. Now let's move on to an example, all right? So reasons are appropriate for certain things, like why something happens, what something is, or how something works. Examples are inappropriate for that, but they're appropriate for something else. Examples are instances or specimens that are carefully chosen or selected to support a claim. For instance, in order to support the claim that all men are mortal, one may give examples of all the men that one knows that have died. On the other hand, one may also offer counterexamples in order to criticize or withdraw support from a claim. For instance, one may attack the claim that all men are mortal by offering Jesus or Socrates or Krishna as examples of men who are not mortal. So guys, what are you doing with an example? Well, a reason supports a story that you want to tell about something. An example supports a claim, all right? So if you propose something, especially kind of quantitative, like all men are this, or all molecules are this, well, the best way to support that isn't reasons. The best way to support that is to give examples, because you're making a claim that all the things in this category have a certain predicate, all right? All right, next, distinctions. Distinctions are contrasts that take two concepts or ideas that are confused or messy and differentiates them meticulously. What does the word meticulous mean? Have you heard this word before, meticulous? What does it mean? Exactly, yeah. So these distinctions take two things that are confused and messy and differentiates them meticulously, however subtle or nuanced the difference may be, so as to enable us to appreciate the implications of this difference. So for example, in this class, remember I took some time and explained to you why I think there's a distinction to be made between wisdom on the other hand and smartness on the other. Because I think in the popular mind, those two are likely to be conflated as if they're the same thing. All right? So if you want to add value to philosophy, give good reasons, give good examples, and a useful distinction is always very helpful. If you can take something that's confused and say, wait a minute, everybody thinks these two things are the same, but I'm going to show you why we should think they're different. That really helps in philosophy. Clarification, clarity in philosophy is like a virtue. It's one of the best virtues you can have. Because our habitual thinking is very unclear and kind of obscure, and we're not always aware of it. All right, principles are the last things. Principles are kind of guidelines that direct the evaluation of particular phenomena or ideas. So for example, the principle of non-contradiction states that a proposition cannot be both true and false at the same time. Sounds very, very elementary, but it's very, very helpful too. Guys, if you make a claim, and then somewhere in the same book or in the same essay or in the same paper, you make the opposite claim, you are contradicting yourself. The same claim cannot be both true and false. So that principle, that the same claim cannot be both true and false, it's called the principle of non-contradiction. It's just a very good guiding principle to help you always be aware that you have a standard that you can use to sort out stuff that is bad and keep only the stuff that's good. Here's another principle. It's called the principle of sufficient reason. And this principle, which was made really popular by Leibniz, it says something like this. Everything, every fact, everything has a cause or a reason for why it is the way it is. There are no arbitrary or unexplained things. For everything that is, for every fact that exists, there's a sufficient reason. That is a reason that's sufficient to explain exactly why it is the way that it is. Now that's a deep, deep metaphysical thing. It's hard to see exactly how you would support that, but there are people who believe that this world is designed by a God, right? And he makes no mistakes. He doesn't engage in arbitrary or random activities. The design is down to the smallest detail. So what does that mean? Every fact about this world is full of significance. For every fact of this world, there's a deep, deep reason why it is the way it is and why it's not some other way. All right, some guidelines for writing philosophy papers. Guys, organization of your paper is key because it helps the flow of the reader. A really good flow, it can almost be as good as a good argument. If your paper flow and is well organized and each section naturally, spontaneously leads to the next section, that will really go a long way towards convincing your reader. So first, a paper should have an introduction where you motivate the reader to read more by showing why he should care about it and why it is relevant and important. Guys, if you motivate the reader and you let him know what I'm about to tell you is really, really interesting or really, really critical or really underappreciated, you've got his attention. Now he wants to stick with you. And that might be half the battle. The next section should show explicitly and precisely what your view is on the topic. So after you've motivated the reader for a few paragraphs in one section and you've pulled them in with the hook, now you can be more personal and you can be like, okay, this is why this topic is important. In the next section, this is what I believe about this topic. All right? and this is why I believe it. So now you can get into you. Once you've catered to the reader, you've accommodated him, you've lured him in, now you can get personal and be like, hey, this is what I believe, this is my position on this issue. I believe that gun rights is a big issue. The Second Amendment is a big issue. And after you talk about why it's such a big issue, safety, all this stuff, violence, then you say, my position on the Second Amendment is that we should abolish it. And then you go into why, oh, Scandinavian countries don't have it, blah, 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 blah. Scandinavian countries are great. Low violence, no high suicide. Okay. Now, after you've burdened the reader with all you care about and what you believe, now, as a matter of good etiquette, you should anticipate some possible objections to your view. Guys, this is not what I mean by when I say philosophy papers are different from other papers. The real work in a philosophy paper is this kind of stuff, where you motivate the reader to read what you're going to write. That's common in all essays. You tell the reader what you believe and why you believe it. That also is common. But what gets really philosophical is a move like this, anticipating some possible objections to your view. Only a philosopher would be so magnanimous to say, look, here's what I believe, but who am I? Who am I to pretend like I'm flawless or like I'm above criticism? You know what, dear reader, I'm going to do you a favor. I'm going to let you see that I'm self-conscious of my fallibility, and I'm going to criticize myself. I'm going to anticipate what my critics would say about me. That is like true philosophy. That is true philosopher. But just because you anticipate those objections doesn't mean you don't get to do what's in D. You can then offer replies to those objections. So you entertain the objections, you do honor to them, you show them in their best light, and then you deflate them later on with your replies. You show why either they're not good objections, or they're irrelevant, or they're straw men, or whatever. And then finally, guys, you offer a conclusion in which you summarize what you've achieved in the paper and highlight its relevance and maybe areas for further research. And that's it. That's all you have to do to write a philosophy paper. So remember the essays that I have you writing, right? You may want to give it this form. That would be fine. Or you may want to just answer point by point. There are 5 points, right? 5 points, each worth 5 points. You can just do it that way. I'm not asking you to do it this way, but I do want to expose you to this because I think the structure of a philosophy paper shows the mentality and the ethics of a philosopher, what he considers excellent. To a philosopher, it's excellent to anticipate what your opponent would say to you and be generous and magnanimous, and then give a good reply. All right, so first thing that helps is making an outline. Making an outline before you write can help you to plan or sketch your paper and get an overview of its architecture before getting caught in the details. This way you will know which details are relevant for which section of the paper and how things should be organized to give the best flow for the reader. So making an outline, guys, means this. First of all, it means not procrastinating, right? If you make an outline 12 hours before the due date, I mean, that's not going to help. But if you have a couple of weeks ahead, well, instead of actually writing the paper 3 weeks before, do some architecture. Do some architecture. Look at the big picture. Look at the broad structure you want to kind of go with. And then spend a lot of time on the sections, the broad sections. And then take notes for each section. Just little points for each section. Then, as you get closer to the time for actually turning it into a paper, it'll be much easier. You'll be less intimidated, about how am I going to produce 2 pages for this section and 2 more for that section. Your notes will naturally be the kinds of things that you can easily turn into sentences and paragraphs. Okay? All right, number 3, stick to the point and answer the question. Make sure that you omit all irrelevant parts of the paper so that the reader doesn't get distracted. If a section is in your paper, then it must be necessary. Otherwise, it should be eliminated. Also, if you raise a question in the introduction, then make sure you actually answer it in the rest of the paper. Guys, things being streamlined and everything being focused is very important. All these digressions and little tangents are unnecessary and they distract the reader. So once you have a view, commit to supporting that view to the end, eliminate anything that distracts from the support of that view, and you'll be fine. Number 4, stylistic points. Philosophy is hard enough as it is, so using big words or technical jargon unnecessarily only makes comprehension worse for the reader. A simple style that strives for clarity and precision is ideal. Only use technical words when they are useful or add value. Otherwise, their idle usage will cause obscurity and confusion. Guys, philosophy is already hard enough as it is. We're trying to support stuff like whether God exists, whether abortion is permissible, whether or not, who? Tell me who. Katy Perry is better than Taylor Swift. We're trying to argue that kind of stuff. That's hard enough to support as it is. Now, if you start confusing the reader with unnecessary big words because you think it's impressive, he will not know what you're talking about. And just one paragraph of using 12 unnecessary words, he won't know what you're talking about. So it's about the opposite of that. It's about being so simple that he could not mistake what you're saying. He could not go wrong. And then simplicity can be a kind of avenue for making things interesting or even deep or profound. So the simpler you make things in your style, then you can take things from the trivial level to the rather interesting or even the deep level. But if you think that you're going to get to the deep by avoiding simplicity and just using big words, you're going to confuse the reader, man. And you can't get a good grade that way because it's incomprehensible. Any questions? Can you move on to some philosophy now? I think we have enough time to start a couple of the cosmological arguments. Any questions? So, the cosmological arguments. We only have, 15 minutes? 10 minutes. Yeah. Aquinas has 5 big arguments. I think technically only 3 of them are strictly cosmological arguments. But here goes. When we looked at Anselm, we looked at the ontological argument. The ontological argument is called ontological because it claims that if you just understand the ontology of the concept of God, that is the kind of being that the concept represents, you can figure out just from the concept of that being that it's the kind of being that exists and exists necessarily. Because since it's a perfect being, it has all perfections, and what can be more perfect than the attribute of reality or existence, actually being, all right? So that's Anselm. Now, we're looking at a very different kind of argument. Remember, with Anselm, it's purely logical, purely conceptual. You don't have to look at the world to figure out that God exists. You can just understand the concept, you get it? Just by understanding the concept, you'll see that the concept, if rightly understood, has implications, ontological and metaphysical implications. So if you understand the concept right, then you can't deny that this concept can't just be a thought or an idea, it must be an actual being. Now, the cosmological argument is very different. The cosmological argument says, look, the ontological argument, there's something a bit funny about that. How can you smuggle in existence merely from a thought or or a psychological state. So the cosmological argument says, yes, you can figure out that God exists by reason. Faith isn't the only way. You can figure out that God exists. But you have to look at the fact that the cosmos or the universe exists. And if you really appreciate properly that the universe exists and you observe it and you see how it exists, then you will come to the conclusion that there must be a God. Now, what the definition of God might be different from the way Anselm defined him, but no importa, it's something that we can talk about. So here we go. The first is called, these are Aquinas' arguments. Anselm was ontological, Aquinas is cosmological. The first, there are 5. We're going to get through a few of them. The first of them is the argument from change. Aquinas says, look, let's observe the world. One of the features in the world is change. Now, any particular part of the world that's changing cannot be, now this is very important, and I want to hear what you guys think about the logic of this. Any particular part of the world that is changing cannot be changing itself. If a part of the world is changing, then that change must be coming from something other than the thing that's changing. Now, why would he say that? Well, he has this idea of actuality versus potentiality. Now, what this means is that if anything changes, then it must be in a potential state to become the actual change. All right? So there are 2 possible states for any given thing in the world that changes. There's the potential to change before the change, and then the actuality after the change. Now, it's true that you can change from potential to actual for any given attribute in the world, but what Aquinas wants to hold on to dogmatically is that you cannot at the same time, for the same property, be both potentially have that property and actually have the property at the same time. Do you see why? If you have a property potentially, then okay, you have it potentially, but you can also at the same time have it actually. So what are we talking about? A particular body can have the potential to move, right? Oh, do you have a hand up? Oh, okay. Yeah, a potential body can have the potential to move, right? Has the potential to move. But if it has the potential to move, that implies that it's not moving. It just has the potential. So a body can either have the potential to move or it can actually be moving. Same with heat, right? A body can either have the potential to be hot or it can be actually hot. But it can't both be in a potential state to be hot and be actually hot at the same time. So because it can't be both at the same time, that's Aquinas' argument for saying, look, a body can't cause itself to change, whether it's in terms of heat or motion. Why? Because if it caused itself to change, can you see that it would have to be both potential and actual at the same time? If you're causing yourself to change, that means you have the potential to change, but you're also actual at the same time. And those 2 things can't coexist. You cannot both be in the potential state to change and in the actual state that changes the potential. So whatever causes you to change must be from the actuality of some other state, not your own actuality. You have the potential to change, and something actual, external to you, causes you to convert from potential to actual. Is this making sense? Do you follow the reasoning? Okay. So that's the logical basis. Once we get that basis down, now we have to introduce the idea of a series. Introducing the idea of a series, guys, just simply says this. The changes we see in the world don't just happen in one part of the world, but we see series of changes leading to one another, series or sequences. And his reasoning is that, yeah, Change is something that happens in different parts of the world, and it spreads in series or sequences. One thing changes another, which changes another, which changes another. Now, his reasoning is this can go on for a long time, but it cannot go on forever. Eventually, you must have one change that starts all the other changes. You see that? His reasoning is this. If a series goes on forever, then it'll never get started. You see that? If it truly goes on forever, then it's infinity. It never gets, how will you start an infinite series? In his mind, the very fact that it's infinite means it never starts. There's no starting point. That's what infinity means. There is no starting point. So there is no first cause. So he says it cannot go on forever. Whatever changes we see in the world do occur in series, but these series cannot go on forever. And so what's the conclusion? There must be one very special member of the series that gets the whole series started. And you know what the name of that member is, right? God. Guys, that's a really, actually, we can just end there. You know what? Because the rest are going to be kind of different plays on the same kind of idea. Please reread your Aquinas for next class. We're going to go very fast because all of these things are kind of reiterations of the same thing. Reread Aquinas, reread Paley, and then reread your Leibniz. And I'm going to end it here and then take attendance.